Your Honour, my name is McAvoy. I appear for the prosecution. May I address the jury?
Yes, Mr. McAvoy.
Ladies and gentlemen, even though you might think that you're sitting in the La Boite Theatre tonight, you're actually jurors in the war crimes trial of Samuel Griffith. You have a reserved sign in front of you, some of you. You should imagine that on one side of that piece of paper is the word guilty. And on the other side, it's the word not guilty. The word's not guilty. At the end of this trial, you will be asked to stand in judgment and determine whether, in fact, Samuel Griffith is guilty of war crimes. Thank you. So, just a little bit of theatre to get started. They say all barristers are frustrated actors. And I should say, I had an offer to come to Griffith when I left high school, and I went to the Aboriginal Legal Service for some summer work, and the principal legal officer said, "Change to law, please change to law," and I changed over to law and ended up here. So, okay, so this is the trial, and Sammy G, I've just called him Sammy G because there's a set of chambers in Sydney called Samuel Griffith Chambers, and it's colloquially known by everybody in Sydney as Sammy G Chambers, because it's such a nice guy and they're so affectionate. So I just want to start by briefly. I know there's you're not all lawyers. You don't want to necessarily do this, but in Australia it should be 1945, not 1949. In Australia we have a War Crimes Act, and Section 7 of the War Crimes Act provides a serious crime is a war crime if it is committed in the course of hostilities in a war, in the course of an occupation, in pursuing a policy associated with the conduct of war or an occupation, or on behalf of or in the interests of a power conducting a war or engaged in an occupation. So think about the things that you've heard this morning. Think about the acts that you are aware of yourself, and ask yourself whether you think that might fit into the description of a war or an occupation. But we have to think about what is a war. And so Section 5 of the War Crimes Act provides a definition. This is the Australian Commonwealth legislation. War means a war, whether declared or not, any other armed conflict between countries, or a civil war or similar armed conflict. And then I've bolded it for you because it's of its importance. Whether or not involving Australia or a country allied or associated with Australia, insofar as it occurred in Europe in the period between the beginning of September 1939 and the ending on the 8 May 1945. Clearly, when they were enacting this legislation, they were thinking about who they needed to protect. So, in the course of this war crimes trial that I'm going to talk to you about, I want you to accept for the purposes of the exercise that Section 5 says 8th of May 1845. And it includes in Australia. So, there's this ongoing discussion about whether acts of war are or are not murder or massacre of British subjects. I was just going to talk to you about this false notion that Aboriginal people became British subjects. Yes, we were treated for the purposes of punishing us, but for anything that was to our benefit, we weren't treated as British subjects. And I have to say that the period that we're talking about with Samuel Griffith, you must remember that the Geneva Convention about how people are treated during war commenced, the first iteration of it commenced in 1862. So these discussions were going on internationally. You can't say that there was not international discussion at the relevant period about how people should be treated during the course of conflict, because there was. So Henry Reynolds this morning speaks of a one-off mock trial, but I have been thinking about it over a number of years as live theatre. And my thoughts have led me to a number of ingredients that are necessary to ensure that the live theatre is done properly and achieves its purpose. So it would need to be done in ownership or partnership with the relevant First Nations. There would need to be an understanding of what war crimes trial procedure is like, just to ensure that it can't be torn down too easily. It would need thorough historical research. You would need a playwright. You would need an audience as a jury. But perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, it would need to be built in a repeatable format, so that we could set up this kit and we could try Henry Denga, who funded the defence for the Mile Creek Massacre. Mm-hmm. And we could get a historian from the Blue Mountains, the local mob could run it, you could use local lawyers, and then the kit could be handed on to Brisbane. And on and on. And so we can deal with the local issues with the local people. So in my conception of it, the case is opened by the prosecutor. So I'd like to be the prosecutor. I'd like to be the prosecutor of Samuel Griffith. I'd like to have somebody wearing the period costume and have a big beard. And I'd like to cross-examine them. Oh boy, I'd love to cross-examine them. Anyway, I think that the descendants of the first peoples involved could play their ancestors. I think they could tell in the first act their story of their life before invasion and the lead up to the arrival of the frontier. And I'll tell you, one of the stories that travelled ahead of the frontier was the story of the Yaraman. And that's the story of the devil dog with the red eyes. And horses were known to be the Yaraman. And everywhere you go across the East Coast, everybody knows the word Yaraman as the word for horse. And it's been related to a dreaming story about that devil dog. And these are the things that the troopers rode in on. And so the information I have is that people heard about the Yaraman coming to their country. And I should say, I've probably seen, I'm a native title lawyer amongst other things, I've probably seen about 50 connection reports across the country, which are reports prepared by the anthropologist after doing all the research and speaking to the traditional owners, and there is not a single one in which is not marked by murder and massacre. Not a single one. It's so pronounced. It's just a surprise to me that it's taken so long for people to come to terms with it. Act 2 is the massacre, or the dispersal, or the reprisals. And the event is acted out, and perhaps you could have a First Nations person describing what's happening. What they heard had happened to their neighbours. Maybe you could have a white pastoralist giving evidence about how they got some sheep killed, so therefore it was necessary to kill 50 Aboriginal people. Or a native trooper telling how they were told upon their conscription that if they didn't do the right thing, their family would suffer at the hands of the government and the police at home. And then we go to Act 3, and we deal with the evidence of the culpability of the accused. And the accused gives evidence and gets cross-examined by some uppity black lawyer. And the First Peoples perhaps can give rebuttal evidence. Maybe the newspaper editor can give evidence about what the stories were around the time. Because what we would need to establish is constructive knowledge. if we don't have direct knowledge. And then the prosecutor closes the case. The audience, as the jury, as I say, will be given a two-sided sign on entry to the theatre. One side says guilty, the other not guilty. The judge asks the audience, how do you find the accused? And the audience hold up their signs and you just do a straw poll. And you do it night after night, as long as you can get an audience in there. Why? Well, like Henry, who I've known for a long time, I could say, I read the research piece by Tony Roberts on the brutal truth of what happened in the Gulf country. And for those of you who haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. It's not a long piece, but it tells of the complicity and the direct involvement, in fact, of the political elite of South Australia in the attempted extermination of people in the Gulf country. It implicates clearly Downer and Gray. And it incensed me. It incensed me that this is not public knowledge and that we have suburbs in Canberra named after Downer and we have a federal electorate named Gray. I thought about Macquarie and I thought about Dangar, and I thought what they were doing were war crimes. They must be. So that's what led me back to the War Crimes Act. And after that, I've talked to a few friends, Leah Purcell and her husband are good friends of mine. I've been talking with them about how we can do this, and I spoke to another playwright as well. I spoke to Justice Mark Irace, who's a Supreme Court judge and was a prosecutor in the International War Crimes Tribunal, about giving some technical advice on making sure that the approach was correct, and he was very keen. And Mark was in chambers with me in Frederick Jordan Chambers in Sydney. But then I got a little bit distracted. I got fixated on the former New South Wales Premier, William Foster. He publicly advocated for the extermination of Aboriginal people. He was a Premier of New South Wales, so therefore including Queensland, in 1841, I think. And he was saying we should exterminate them. And there was a Commissioner for Police at the time when he became Premier who was saying, no, we need to be more circumspect about what we do. We need to figure out a way of doing this better. And he sacked that police commissioner upon getting into power. He was involved in the leadership of the massacre at Paddy's Island in Bundaberg, and I know the Gurung people and the Terrabulang Bunda, whose country that is, whose ancestors were massacred. We went through that material in detail in their native title claim where I acted for them, and they still bear the scars of that. And the estimates are somewhere between 300 and 900 people being murdered because, if I remember correctly, one of Blaxland's brothers was killed. And he has the town of Foster in New South Wales named after him. Quite ironically, I suppose, under that land belongs to the Warramai people, and in their language, the place is called Minimba, which is a place of peace. But they have had the indignity foisted upon them of it being named after this terrible man. He also took a Mary River lungfish back to Sydney, and now you'll find its botanical name includes his name. Yet the Mary River lungfish, I know, is a totemic species for the Kabi Kabi people from where it was taken. And so these types of injustices and historical silence is rife throughout Australia. But why Griffith? Well, Griffith, for me, it's a bit of a personal matter, I must say. The frontier came through my great-grandfather's country in the 1860s in Claremont. Claremont was mentioned earlier. it was a brutal extermination. So in our native title claim group, we cover a vast area of land. You know, the general conceptions of landed estates for Aboriginal people is that we're sort of 50 to 100 people and of an area that is not too large. And my calculations say that there's probably about 800 to 1,000 of our people occupied the lands, our territory. But when we prepared the native title claim, all of our people were confined to just 12 apical ancestors. That's all that could be found. That's it. 12 people. And it's a matter of, for me, and I know it for others, of immense grief. I grieve for all those families and the kin that were exterminated. And our culture destroyed. And I have to say, when I talk about these things, sometimes I tell people about sort of very personal side of it, and I'll tell you today, just as an experiment when thinking about how we tell truth, what we do. I just looked up one of the landholders who had been granted some land in the late 1960s, so it might have been just before the tenure of Griffith. Same government. And they were granted this property on Elgin Downs. And there was a conflict. One of their two brothers was killed. Their name was Muirhead. And then the next thing we know all the Aboriginal people had been removed from that area. It's a vast station. So those people are my people. They're my ancestors. And I thought, well, what's the consequence of this? And I traced just on the internet, anybody can do it, I traced the Muirhead family online. And I ended up with somebody in Perth who's a CEO or chairperson of an ASX 100 and very wealthy. While at the same time, the people who owned that land immediately before the government granted it to the Muirheads, my family, we've had, in my present generation, I've got 43 first cousins on my father's side, which is the Aboriginal side of my family. In that side of the family, we've had half a dozen suicides. Every man has been to jail or been under the attention of the police. Most people are unable to work from the intergenerational trauma, and we are still suffering from that decision. And we are still economically deprived as a result of that. We are poor people, and yet the sliding door moment when our richness was taken from us and given to somebody else, they still benefit from that. That benefit still resides in that moment. So these are real consequences. This is not some, I don't say this in a pejorative sense, this is not some academic exercise. So for me, Griffith is one of many of the very acts of forgetting and silence we see in memorialisation all over the country. And for me, the continued silence is a continuation of the acts of colonisation. So in my view, he should be tried, and if he's found guilty, I should have added that in there. I thought probably already convicted. And stripped of his legacy, because in reality, we speak about legacy. I heard somebody talk about legacy before. It's not really his legacy. He's dead. It's the legacy of the colony, and it's the legacy of the colony is holding on grimly to this notion that everything was done in a way that the poor blackfellas they were never going to be able to withstand what was coming. It was always going to come. What a load of crap. So the colony must own its past. If we and the Aboriginal people of this country, as the load bearers for the rest of Australia's wealth, if we are to be free and to be allowed to develop according to our own conceptions of our future. So I just wanted to go a little bit of a tangent before I sit down. As I said before, I'm the co-senior counsel assisting the York Justice Commission. That's in Victoria. I'm not sure if you've all heard of it, but it's a truth-telling commission. We've heard evidence from a number of elders, and we heard evidence from the co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria about their aspirations for their treaty processes and political representation. We also heard evidence from the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, and she's in this photo. This is in the hearing room. She's speaking to the chair, Auntie Eleanor Burke. That's Uncle Wayne Atkinson, who's also a commissioner. You can see the chairs there, and it's possum skins. And instead of having the
Queen?
the symbol, the
Oh, that's one.
yes. We've got the Europe symbol there. The hearing room is in a circle to symbolise it being some ceremonial. The witnesses sit here, and it is intended to go in depth into all of the historical injustices in Victoria. And so, my view is that we are not going to leave any stone unturned that we can pursue. And the commission is going to seek an extension of time. It's currently running until July 2024, but it's going to seek a 2-year extension. So this is not short term, and this is not superficial. And I should add that the McAvoy Commission has just been the subject of policy statements by the new Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Linda Burney, and she's saying that the federal government's committed to a McAvoy Commission which involves truth-telling and treaty making. And I expect that the federal government federal government's involvement will ensure that we see that type of commission start here in Queensland as well, and in New South Wales. So the truth is coming, in my view, and I don't think it's avoidable. I think it's a moment in time for this country where we have to confront it, all of us. And I say to people, try and get ahead of it. Try and think about what you will say when the Truth Commission comes to you. What will you say? What are you going to say? What are you going to tell your kids or your grandkids about when you had the opportunity to go and talk about your people or your family's involvement in the dispossession of Aboriginal people in this country? What are you going to say? You're going to dodge it, or are you going to be involved? So I encourage people to have those conversations around their dinner table and figure out what they're going to do. The last thing I'll say is that we are here, all of us, creating history. I know you're all acutely aware of this. The history isn't just what happened last century or the century before. The history, tomorrow's history is being created right now, and the action and inaction of government players right now will be the subject of this sort of analysis in the future. And that goes for university councils as well. So that's really all I had to say. I'm sorry for rushing through it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fiona, for pulling us together. It's an incredibly strong and courageous thing to do, and I take my hat off to you. And I've got a meeting that I've got to step into at 2:30, so I'll be here till then.
Thank you, Tony. Tony has to rush off at 2:30. I'm just wondering if there's any immediate questions for him now. We can maybe take one, and Elena is immediately, yes, at it.
I was wondering, great presentation. Did you get anywhere with your idea, after speaking to playwrights and the...
Yes.
Yeah, so what's happening?
They said, come and let's do it.
Yeah.
When you've got a few spare moments, let's get into it.